Here we go, Rabbi. So welcome, Shalom Aleichem. We're going to learn a little bit of Torah today. So the topic today is actually an Elul topic, even though it does not look like an Elul topic, and it's a topic of all or nothing. And this is a really important topic when it comes to, we're arriving at New Year, Rosh Hashanah, and a lot of resolutions or attempted resolutions are made. And one of the things that happens to us is that we fall into this trap of all or nothing. So we're going to go across the Jewish year and look at different models of things. But we're going to start off with Chanukah with a really, really fascinating piece of research. And this research was conducted in 2011. And one of the researchers is Ayelet Fishbach, and she made a lot of very interesting research relating to Jewish practices. And so the research was they took college students and they asked them, how many nights of Chanukah do you light candles? Now, clearly we're in the non-Orthodox sector, because in the Orthodox sector, you have to light every night. But when you're in the world outside of Orthodoxy, where in a certain sense, you do what you feel, right? So then the notion of obligation actually works differently, which we'll discuss in just a moment. The question is so people would light, but they wouldn't light all the time necessarily. So they started doing a research as to what it would be. So if you take a look, top page 2, the pattern of adherence to religious standards confirmed our hypothesis. The position on a given night in the 8-night sequence predicted participants' menorah lighting behavior. That is the likelihood that they would answer yes as opposed to no or don't remember to the question. So she presents there's a table over here of how many people, of the percentage of adherence, and you'll notice that of the, let's say 100% of the students who were questioned on the first night of Chanukah, 76% of them lit. It drops in the second night to 55%, then drops to 50, then to 48, then to 49, to 43, so it's downward trending every night of the Chanukah. But then it comes night 7 and 8, there's a resurgence to 45% to 57%. Right, so this is what's called the U-curve, right? So it starts off high, tapers downwards, and then there's an element of a resurgence at the end in terms of the lighting. And where I picked this up was actually in Daniel Pink's book called When, where he talks about the different aspects of time, and he points out that actually this U-curve is found in many different places in research. One of them is in happiness in life, actually. What does that mean? Is when they ask people in generally, how satisfied are you with life, they find that it's also a U-curve. They find that in people in their 20s are very, very happy. They're, the world of possibilities ahead of them and responsibility is not yet hit. And as they go to the 30s and 40s, it tapers downwards. People, it's extremely stressful. There's career responsibilities, there's marriage, there's children, there's a lot of high stress. And as I move to the 50s and 60s, it starts going upwards again, which means there's a general satisfaction. Life satisfaction is also a U-curve as well. So the way he quotes it is, happiness climbs high early in adulthood, but begins to slide downwards in the late 30s and early 40s, dipping to a low in the 50s. But we recover quickly from the slump, and a well-being later in life often exceeds that in our younger years. That's good to know, right? So this is all positive. This is right. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful idea, right? It's the same U-curve, right? It's the same U-curve, and he plots out multiple things where the U-curve appears in life. Now, I'd like to just sort of focus on the Chanukah piece over here and what happens in people's minds. And it makes so much sense, because what happens? Imagine, let's say you're not thinking from an obligation perspective, but you're thinking it's a nice thing, right? So you start off and everybody's lighting the Chanukah candles, but there's 8 days. You get lost somewhere in the middle in the shuffle, and then comes the last day and they say, oh, today's Vazos Chanukah, today's the last day. So you're like, oh yeah, I'm gonna climb back onto the train, right? There's something about how we try to do what we do, which is that we succeed, and then we slide, and how we try to climb back on again. That's the U-curve. The U-curve is we try to recover the lost ground in the middle. This is why at the end of races, people are able to have a spurt, which is that last spurt to get to the end of the marathon comes at the very end, even though the middle there's been, the cramping, and it's just fascinating how this works, that the extra energy when we have the goal comes closer to us.
We have that, you discussed as well.
Yeah, so we have
minute of life.
So there's a lot of things where it appears, and I'd like to trace it down in the halachic realm, to the notion of incentivization, which I think is incredibly important. Because like this, is the higher you place the goals, on the one hand, the more likely people are to want to reach those goals. On the other hand, the higher you raise the bar, at the same time, that means to say that fewer people will make the bar, and therefore they'll give up along the way. Right? So this is a very delicate, we'll call it guiding of the masses. How do you guide masses through ideas is how high do you place that bar, and how many stations along the way do you allow for re-entry afterwards? How much of a compromise do you make in the realm of halacha? Now, it's a sensitive question because, we're not the ones right now creating the halachic framework. This was created during the times of Anshe Knesset Gdola onwards in many of these aspects. There's some halacha l'Moshe Misinas, but many of these were created later. And the question becomes is, how do you frame that? So I'd like to look at a few examples with you with this in mind, with this Chanukah U-curve in mind, seeing the sensitivities and then perhaps reflecting it on our own lives. So the first place is Sefiras Haomer, because of course we're in Elul, so we want to talk about Inyan Diyama. And if you look at the notion of Sefiras Haomer in the Torah tells us to count 7 weeks, and it counts 49 days, which is wonderful. And so if I'd walk away from just the text of the Torah itself, I would say to myself, I have a responsibility of 7 weeks or 49 days, and skip a few, meaning if I miss a few, okay, right? Meaning meaning I'll do the best I can. If I'm supposed to carry 49 marbles and 20 of them fall on the floor, I'll still carry on carrying the rest, right? I'm going to try to hold on to it. However, interestingly enough, we see voices which indicate differently. That these are not separate marbles, they're a chain. So as an example, the Zohar HaKadosh says in source 1, the Tochazi, come and see, Kol Barnosh Deloy Mani Chushbana Da Inon Shiva Shabbos Timimos Lemizke Lidachiosa Deloy Ikre Tahar. A person didn't count the fullness of the 49 days, this is all in Aramaic, is not considered pure. Meaning you need to have the entire chain as well. This is related in halachic reality. So, for instance, in source 3, the Tur, this is the proto Shulchan Aruch. So, Rabbeinu Yaakov makes observation where he says in the second paragraph, Kozavod Baal Halachas Gedolos. It's a very famous comment from the Baal Halachas Gedolos, which is found in Tosfos in Achos. Shim Shachach Levarech Be'echad B'nei Yomim Shelo Yavarech Od B'Yomim Shela Achrov. That if you forget one day of the Sefiras Haomer, you may no longer count anymore. In other words, they're all interconnected. You're missing one, you're missing everything, right? It's all or nothing, the way he frames it. Notice, by the way, they're not really agrees. So, for instance, Rav Sadia Gaon wrote, She'im shachach be'echa b'nei yamim yavarech b'yamim sha'acharov. Rav Sadia says, no problem. You missed one, carry on counting, carry on blessing, and the only exception is chutz milah l'rishona. She'im shachach v'lo birech sh'lo yavarech oid. He said, if you forgot the first night, where were you? Did you miss the Seder? Like what? But if you missed the first night, you can't carry the rest because you didn't start. You didn't even get out of park, right? So, but if other nights, it's fine. For Rav Hai Kosav, Rav Hai, these all the Goin. This is pre-Rishonim. Says Kosav ben belayla Rishon ben belayla shar leilos im shachach v'lei birech yivarech b'shar leilos. Rav Hai Gon says you miss one of the nights, even the first night. Carry on blessing. They're all they are independent, not interdependent, and therefore you're allowed to say a blessing. This is as, by the way, notice that we're in about 1,000 years ago. This is where this dispute is happening. This is post Gemara, but pre Rishonim, before the medieval commentators, before the Shulchan Aruch, which was published in the 1500s. This is as halacha about this is coalescing. Right? Obviously there's different practices based on different locations and different teachers. Okay, how does it coalesce into the halacha we know today? So I guarantee that most people don't know this halacha. Let's understand what's going on. So we see there's a three-way dispute, right, between the Go'onim as recorded in the Torah, right? Go'onim refers to a Go'on is a person who was a Rosh Yeshiva in one of the major yeshivas, Pumbedisa, Masa Machasya, in the Babylonian and Israel. We'll call academies of study. So when you have the name Gaon, like Rav Sadia Gaon, Rav Hai Gaon, that refers to the name Rosh Yeshiva in those days. Okay, that's. So this is the time of the Gaonim. How does it coalesce in halacha? The Shulchan Aruch says in source 4, Shachach v'lo birech kol halayla yispar bayom b'lai bracha. If you forget to count at night, so you don't have the entire day ahead of you, count in the day and you're all right, but do it without a bracha. Now, our critical halacha, im shachach levarech be'echad me'ayamim. If you forgot to count one of the days of Sefiras Haomer, be'en yom rishon, be'en mishar yamim, whether the first or any other day, sofer b'shar yamim b'lei bracha. You count the rest of the days without a bracha. How does the Shulchan Aruch paskin? This is the critical piece here. Does the Shulchan Aruch paskin like the Bahag, or like the Rav Saadia Gaon, or like Rav Hai Gaon?
Sounds like a bridge position.
You see, most people think the Shulchan Aruch paskin is like the Bahag, and he is not paskin like the Bahag. The Shulchan Aruch is not saying that if you forget a night, you don't count anymore. That's not what he says. What does he say? He says you count. Like Rav Hai Gaon, but you do it without the bracha. Isn't that fascinating? Meaning, there's a dispute. If you lose one, do you lose all? And there's a debate about that. So what does he do? He says it's a compromise. If you drop one, you carry on counting, but you do so without the bracha. That's the bridge, right? So do you see what it is? And this is a classic way the halacha is titrated when you have a dispute. Now, the reason why most people don't know this is because most people, when they forget a night of Sirah, what do? They drop it. And that's exactly what happens. In their minds, ironically, the bracha is so educational, it gives so much importance to it, that they understand that when there's no bracha, there's no value. But there is. There is value in counting the rest. You see what the Shulchan Aruch is doing? The Shulchan Aruch is trying to bridge the idea of having a lofty goal, like the notion of the Bahag, which is Timimos, of everything being pure. At the same time is, a lot of people are going to fall off the wayside. Right? A lot of people, by the way, especially women, because men have the advantage of Ma'ariv. Right? And if you're at Ma'ariv, it's a lot easier to remember to do Sefiras Haomer. Right? But even so, you're traveling, there's so many reasons not to. The reality of life is a lot of people are going to forget. And that's this balance, is trying to be able to have the high value of a full service at the same time as is the flexibility of partial success. Which is being balanced over here. It should be noted that there are those who are therefore in disagreement with even the Shulchan Aruch. So here's a book which was published before the Shulchan Aruch called the Sefiras Haomer. The Sefiras Haomer, when quoting this, actually leans into this dispute, and he says in source 5, he says in the second paragraph, for you forget one day you cannot count anymore. It's one mitzvah. If you forgot one of them, you lost the entire count. He says that most people don't agree. Most of the teachers in this generation don't agree with us. Meaning the safety net is larger, says the Sefiras Haomer. By the way, it's not Paskin Halacha, but this is pre-Shulchan Aruch. And he's saying, I think that, and most of the teachers around us at this time say, if you forget one, you go the next and you say, yesterday was, and you carry on. So you haven't lost everything. The whole thing hasn't sunk. Sorry.
Isn't it a mitzvah to say Shehazman Grama? Are women still mechuyev?
Absolutely. So good question. So it is a mitzvah to say Shehazman Grama. So a woman is not obligated, but it's in the category where a woman is certainly opt in and can do it. Fantastic. Right? So like in the same way as a lulav is a mitzvah to say Shehazman Grama, and women opt in and say a bracha. It should be noted that in the Sephardic world, that the women opt in, but they don't say a bracha. But in the Ashkenazi world, they say a bracha and so on. Now this is a classic idea. But yes, absolutely. So, but again, the balance is how hard you put that mark over here. Similarly, as an example, this chumash called the Heichal HaBracha makes this comment. He quotes this Bahag and so on, and he says in the fifth line. He said at the end of the fourth line, he says, neged roiv binyan v'roiv minyan. This psak of the Shulchan Aruch that like the Bahag, that if you lost one, you don't count the bracha, is against most of the poskim. V'chein hunag Adoni Avimori rochav. My father is passing this as well. We'll call out tzadikim. Kach halacha psuka beligim gomshim shachach lispor yam echad sofer b'shar leros b'vracha. If you forget one, you carry on right now. We don't. Again, it's not up to people to paskin by themselves. Right. So this is not, you don't have the right to sort of, to disagree with the Shulchan Aruch in such a way, but no, what is he saying? He's saying is that most of the poskim did not require that it was only one mitzvah. If you lose one, you lose everything. And part of this struggle, I would say that you may say that this debate is simply a debate of how to understand the word temimos. What does it mean, Sheva Shabbos temimos diena? What does it mean, complete? And the Bahag says that this is what complete means, and the Rav Haigon says it means referring to the process, not each day. But that you could argue that's what it is. But I could also argue that psychologically, the question is how do you lead lots of people towards success? Do you raise the bar or lower the bar? Right? You raise the bar, and a great number of people will succeed at hitting that bar because you raise it to them. But if you raise it, then a whole bunch of people are just going to completely miss out. Psychologically, they'll turn off the moment they miss it. Whereas you lower the bar, more people will make it, but then the bar is lowered. That is part of this debate, and it's a very significant part of how do we educate even, is this question. Now, let's talk about another example that in halacha. Is intermittent fasting. Intermittent fasting has become so exciting recently. So it's obviously very successful. You burn up your own body fat by you choose a certain window in the day, and it's 6 hours, it's 8 hours. And during that time you can eat. The rest of the time you cannot eat at all. You can have tea, water, liquids, but no calories, and it's very successful in helping people lose weight in the good old-fashioned way of losing weight. So does it have any value? Does intermittent value of fasting have any value on a public fast day? So what I mean is you're not able to make it the whole time. Is there value in partial fasting? So the Shulchan Aruch actually quotes the Gemara. And the Gemara says a very famous statement, which is in source 7, called Tanis Shele Shaka Alo Chama, Tanis Shele Shlimu Atzesa Kochavim, is Eno Tanis. If you have a fast day which does not have a sunset, which means 3 stars, so if you do not make it to the end of the fast day, it's not a fast day, it's nice. Right? You miss breakfast. But it's not a fast. That's what the Shulchan Aruch says. It seems to be very much an all or nothing proposition, right? And that's what the Gemara seems to say very explicitly. So much so that let's say you're going to daven mincha early, and you say, but I'm not going to make it to the end of the fast. I'm going to take a break in the middle of the afternoon. You can't say anenu because anenu is only said if you are fasting. That's what the Shulchan Aruch says. Pretty much an all or nothing proposition. The Haggah, that's Rav Moshe Isserles makes observation. He says, if a person is not able to make it all the way, they may still say anenu even if they're not make it all the way. And so that is what a number of our teachers have taught.
You're saying if you know you're going to break your fast.
That's what it sounds like, right?
You shouldn't be right.
It sounds like that a person perhaps knows he's going to break the fast, but at the time that he's saying mincha, because there's no anenu in shachris, and the reason there's no anenu in shachris is precisely for this reason, is that there's no anenu in shachris because a number of people in this room might not make it all the way, so they can't say anenu b'yom tzon tani seinu, answer us on our fast day if you're not going to make it to the end of your fast day. But mincha, it's more likely you're going to make it, right? The reason why the Baal Tefilah in the morning can say anenu in the Chazaras Hashatz is because he is representing the community, not himself. So even if he, let's say, has an episode later and needs to break the fast, the people he represented, most of them will be finishing the fast. So that's why he can say anenu. But in the afternoon, there's anenu. So let's say a person is saying an early shemincha and is unsure as to whether they can finish the fast. The Shulchan Aruch says you cannot say anenu, whereas the Ramah says there is room to say anenu. The Mishnah Berurah, in commenting on the Shulchan Aruch, says, he says, why? In source 8, he says, so the idea that the Ramah is a little more flexible in saying anenu in a partial fast, he says, the reason of these rabbis, it's actually the Trumas Hadeshin, is Sha'amar HaGemorah Koltani Shalom Shakal of Chama Eno Tanis, V'hainu Af Le'inyan Anenu, Hu Rak Im Kibel Alav Leisanos Yom Shalem, V'lo Yishlimo Da'eno Tanis. Does Eina Mispalel Anenu? Avlam Kibel Alav Rak Ad Mincha Du Litzuri Ba'alma Havitanis Linyan Zush Mispalel Anenu. So the Mishnah Berurah limits this Ramah. Remember, the Ramah seems to say there's more flexibility if you don't make it all the way. There's still value to saying Anenu, right? So it sounds like he's saying there's value to Tanis Sha'os of just a few hours. The Mishnah Berurah says no. That only refers to if the day before you're going into the fast and you say, I don't know if I'm going to make it. I am making the Kabbalah to go till Chatzos. I'm making the Kabbalah to go till 3 o'clock, and you make it to the benchmark you set, then there's value to it, because what do? You lowered the bar, and now you've hit the bar that you've lowered it to, so you've made what you accepted to do. But if your initial intent was to make it till the end, and you didn't make it till the end, then you didn't make it, right? And therefore the anenu would be useless, and even the Ramah would agree with that, meaning it's dependent on the goal you set, even yourself. I would like to make the observation that in the Darkei Moshe, who is the Darkei Moshe?
Ramah.
That's the Ramah himself, just to understand. The Torah is the first book which takes all of the Rishonim, puts it all together in 4 sections called the Arba Turim, which is Orach Chaim, Yerodea, Ibn Ezer, and Choshen Mishpat, and that's where the Shulchan Aruch is built off of. Right on the Torah, there's two main commentary, or 3 main commentaries, and that is the Beis Yosef. That's going to be the Shulchan Aruch later on. He gives the sources, and the Darkei Moshe. The Darkei Moshe is the Moshe Isserles. So that what they do is they first explain the sources of the Torah, and then they write their own book called the Shulchan Aruch. And the Ramah goes on to the Shulchan Aruch. So Darkei Moshe is the proto Ramah. Right, it's the same author. He writes in his commentary on the Torah, "Nearly the Ma'adakos of Ma'ari." He quotes the Ma'ari, "To nagim nispadal anenu afal bishenim mashlim hu adinim loy kibla mi'esmol the heart tanis shas mi'a isa." In the original Darkei Moshe, it's not like the Mishnah Berurah says. It seems right. He says that even if a person intended to get to the end of the day and is going and is chugging along, and then they get a migraine and they're just like knocked out, right? And mid-afternoon they break the fast, there still was value to the anenu, even with a partial fast. Meaning even their goal was so, and their achievement was such. Not like the Mishnah Berurah puts it, right? So meaning to say, there is value in partial achievement, even when one's goals were loftier than what one intended. And this is a little bit sticking to the same question, is there value to part of the meal? Is there value to partial achievements? How high is the bar, and how much am I achieving in that? Is there value to partial achievement? Is the same question. Before we looked at Sefiras Haomer, right? Now looking at the fast days. Let's put yourself in the mind of a person who's now going through this process, knowing these halachas about fasting, and a person is mid-afternoon, they're not feeling good, right? So if they know that there's value to what they're doing, maybe they will break it. But if they know there's no value to what they're doing, maybe they'll keep going, or maybe they'll just say, I've lost it all, right? Meaning there's a lot of psychology to the halacha over here as to how a person relates to their achievements. Can I make it just a little further if I know that it's not valued? Or is it important maybe that there was value to what I did, even though I couldn't make it the whole way? That is part of this the same debate. I'm on the marathon, and I'm at mile 18, right? And can I make it forward? Is there value to stopping now? Will I view myself as a failure if I step off now? I'm at night 5 in the candle lighting. I haven't, right? These are the questions that we all ask ourselves psychologically. Is there value to partial achievement? Here's another example.
Rabbi, just why would the anenu be no good if you broke your fast afterwards with the intent that when you said it that you were going to be fasting?
Yeah, no, so the problem is like this, is that if you view it as an absolute, which is what the Gemara seems to say, is kol tanis sheloi shakal chama, and you know when you're saying your mincha that you're not going to make it to shakal chama, you're not going to make it till the end of the day. No, if you do, then it is. Then
You have to break it.
That's fine. Then it is worth it is valued. The question is if I'm in mincha and I know that I'm probably not going to, that's the question. Is there any value in that as well? Which is sort of that's the acid test for value, right? Is the anenu. Here's another example. Is kavana, right? Intention. They're just the being able to control one's mind during the most important part of the day, which is Tefilah, which is where we reach equilibrium again as we move outwards into the world. So here's the thing. Let's think about this from a halachic perspective. The Rambam in his halachas of Tefilah makes the observation in source 10. There's 5 things which will make your Tefilah render it not valuable, render it insufficient in source 10. He says, even though its time has arrived, taras yodayim, washing your hands. By the way, people don't know this, it's so easy. There's wash basins right outside each shul. You have to wash hands. It says, kisoi erva, being covered, dressed appropriately. Taras mokom tefilah, there can't be dirty things around in the place you're davening. Devarim chov simosai, let's say you're carrying a child. You can't be carrying a child. You can't be carrying a dish or something which you're scared of dropping while you're davening, because there's no way of davening in such a case. But kavana salev, an intent. Now, according to this Rambam, it sounds like if you don't have intent, then goodbye and good luck. Now, if that's the case, that's a pretty strong statement. And he says, kavana. What is this kavana? You empty your heart of all feelings and thoughts. So you see yourself as standing in front of the divine presence. That's a very high bar. It's interesting. That's in Perek Dalet. You see, this is in the 4th chapter of Tehil's Tefilah. But in chapter 10, he says later on, if you didn't daven, you have to go back and daven. But listen to this. But if, let's say, you managed to hold intent for the first of the 19 brachas of the Shemona Esrei, and you did that, and thereafterwards you drifted to the day ahead, the family argument, and the business proposition today, and then you found yourself taking 3 steps backwards, right? You're all right. You don't have to repeat. That's what the Rambam says, right? So this is what's called a stira in the Rambam. The Rambam seems to disagree with himself. In chapter 4, the Rambam says that one of the things which undergirds all of tefillah is intention. If you don't have intention, it doesn't help. But in chapter 10, in Perek Yud, he says, only for the first bracha do you need to repeat yourself. The rest of the brachas, okay, you should have intention, but if you don't have intention, it still works. So which is it? How high is the bar? So this leads us to the very, very famous Reb Chaim, the Reb Chaim Brisk, the Rav of Brisk. He wrote a commentary on the Rambam, and one of this is a very classic, what's called a brisker derech, right? This is where you have a seeming contradiction internally in the Rambam. And what you do is it must be that there's 2 separate dinim, what's called tzvei dinim. There's two different halachas within tefillah. This is a classic brisker Torah. So he observes that there's 2 different types of kavana. The first type of kavana is what's called oimed lifnei melech, which is the Rambam talked about in chapter 4, which is just a simple awareness that I am in conversation or I am in connection with the divine right now. That basic awareness, that latent observation of I am here in front of God, that needs to be. If you don't have that, then you're just swaying around and getting, sometimes my Fitbit tells me I am spinning, right? You're just spinning in the gym, right? You're like, if you don't have that basic awareness, then you're like, there's nothing happening. But the next one is kavana, is referring to understanding what you're saying. Understanding what you're saying, you need to understand the first bracha of the Shemona Esrei. After that, if you didn't, then you don't need to repeat as well, which means there's 2 levels of kavana. The baseline is understanding what I'm doing and where I am. The second level is understanding what I mean. That understanding what I mean and what I'm actually saying, that is only critical for the first bracha, and for the rest of the brachas is not critical. Right? You understand? And that's the way he resolves this dispute in these 2 dinim. That's called the brisker division of the Rambam over here. And at the same time, where does that leave us? That still leaves us with the bar being quite high, if you think about it, which is, you need to know what you're doing, or otherwise it's meaningless, right? You need to realize you're standing in front of Hashem. I don't want to go around the room, because I'd be embarrassed myself, is how many times do we not even have that, right? Meaning, how many times do we sort of drift from that awareness? We even just the awareness of standing in front of the Almighty, which is why you should know that not everybody agrees with this Rambam. For example, so the Beis HaBechira, who wrote the Beis HaBechira? The Meiri, right? So Rav Menachem Meiri. It's interesting, we didn't have a lot of the Meiri because the Beis HaBechira was only found in the archives in, I think, Cambridge. And he lived 600 years ago, but there's a commentary in the entire Gemara, and the Beis HaBechira, the Meiri says, Ma shekosavnu, that we should write in Source 13, She'im ein adam moitze atzma b'das mechuvenes. A person is not able to align and attune their minds. Shelo yispadel, that in such a case he shouldn't daven. Gedolei olam haru shelo noimar kain. That's not the way that most of the teachers have taught us. Ela b'doras harishonim she'achasidu tzofum belibon v'akavona metzuya lohem. They only refer to the early generation of the great pious ones. This is pre-Chassidus, this is the 1400s. Okay? But the great pious ones who could really focus, that's when they said, if you don't have kavana, then you don't daven. Aval b'doras halalu. Today, amazing, right? This is the 1400s. She'ein ha'kavona metzuya kol kach. We do not have the ability to control our minds as much, right? The printing press is about to come out, right? Says, a person should try as much as they can to have focus. as much as is possible, and should feel and be concerned about the ramifications. Don't say, I can't daven because I can't intend. Right? Meaning, if you have the bar as intent is ma'akev, as the Rambam says, is one of the things which, if you don't have it, even the basic level, like we'll call the awareness of my surroundings, and you say, I don't have that, so I can't daven, then in a certain sense, you that's the baby in the bathwater there. The Meiri says, is no. Even standing there and saying those words without any intention, without even basic awareness, has value, right? And it's so important to this. I was speaking to somebody last week, and I was speaking to this person, they were saying, I can't, my mind, I'm not in the zone, so I can't daven, because I'm always thinking about other things. So I was like, no, there's a difference. You could say, my mind is elsewhere, so I don't have kavanah, but that doesn't mean to say, if my mind is elsewhere, I can't say the words. There's a value to the words being said, even with the mind being elsewhere. That's what the Meiri is saying, is again, let's make the bar more attainable for more people, because otherwise it's just psychologically, we're not going to get there. Similarly, the Chazon Ish, this is the Maaseh Ish about the Chazon Ish would say, but Doros HaAchronim, in the recent generations, HaKadosh Baruch Hu makshiv l'tfiloseinu, Hashem listens to our prayers, even when they're not as should be. HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself lowers the bar, so to speak, because of this. I remember one of the great Hasidic giants would say, at the end of Yishtalach, we say, Aboiche b'shirei Zimra. Hashem chooses the songs of Zimra. So he used to say, Habaruch b'shiurei Zimra. Hashem picks up the remainders of the Zimra, right? You came in for Pesukah to Zimra. You're putting on tefillin for the first part. The Chazan was going at breakneck speed. You arrive and you said 1.5 paragraphs. Habaruch b'shiurei Zimra. Hashem picks up the remainders, like the crumbs that are left. Meaning that's where we are. It's all right. It's all right. Meaning, but the point is again, is how high is that bar? And it's interesting to see that some people respond to high bars, but the rest of the 66% under the bell curve don't always, right? They just drop off. They're just not going to make it, right? And so that's the same thing over here. Last topic in this is actually even more esoteric, and that is belief itself. And this is just so fascinating. This goes back to a while back to when Rabbi Norman Lamb of blessed memory opened up what he called the Torah Umada journals. So what it was at that point in time, he was talking about the value of Yeshiva University bridging the secular and the Torah world. And the way he sort of incorporated the secular world was the word Mada, which literally means today knowledge or science, so to speak. Torah Umada became the tagline of YU. And he said, rather than just, just having the slogan, let's research this, and we'll have conferences, and we'll have panels, and we'll have articles written about the synthesis and sometimes the dissonance between Torah and Mada and so on. And by the way, there's been many attempts over history. Rav Hirsch, in a much more humble way, Torah and Derech Eretz, right? If you look at today, the rebranding, if you look at what Dr. Ari Berman has done, Rabbi Berman has talked about what's called the 5 Torahs, right, in YU. There's 5 pillars in YU today. Torah Sa'adam, Torah, and he goes through the interaction of Judaism with 5 different aspects of this world. Very interesting how he's reframed this discussion. But be it as it may, when Rabbi Dr. Norman Lamb was starting this process, he opened up a sort of a discussion on Torah's relationship with the rest of the world within the Orthodox setting. Not just like selling out Judaism, but does serious Judaism have a relationship with the rest of the world? So in the first the first journal of Torah Mada, Rabbi Parnas, Zichrono Livracha, who was one of the YU Rosh Yeshiva at the time, wrote an article on this, and he issued a warning. He issued a warning to the community about this, and he said, he quotes this Rambam, this very famous Rambam that's in Hilchos Avodah Zarah. The Rambam is in source 16, and the Rambam says as follows. He says, Sfarim Rabim Chibru Ovdei Kochavim Ba'avodah. There are many books about pagan worship. Hayach Ikar Avodah, how to serve, Uma Ma'aseh Mishpatzah, and the laws of its service. Tzivonu HaKadosh Baruch Hu shelo likros ba'oson sarim klau. The Almighty said we should not read any of the books of any pagan service. We should not think about it. And we should not speak about it, any of the type of topics in it. We're not supposed to even gaze upon the image of a pagan deity. Al tifnu el ha'elilin. The pasuk says, do not turn to the Elil, to the images. And the Torah says, even speaks to such a person. The person says, maybe I'll see how they serve, just intellectually, just as for the sake of academic posterity. And he says, don't. You're not supposed to do that. Even if you say, I'm just reading about it, I'm not serving it. Involvement leads to connection, and connection leads to service. He says, the pasuk says such. And the Rambam goes on. This is a very famous Rambam. So Rav Parnas, at this moment in time where sort of there's this explosion of teaching, of engagement, says we have to be very careful that all the reading is wonderful, but there are some readings that are not so wonderful, and we as Orthodox Jews are not allowed to read. And so he famously says in source 17, the top of the page 6, based on all of the above, and again you should read it, it's not a long article, it's a 2-3 page article. Torah matter can only be viable if it imposes strict limits on the freedom of inquiry in areas that may undermine the Yigumul Ikare Emunah. Then the Torah matter will have the opportunity to represent itself as an authentic and historical tradition in Jewish thought. Meaning, you don't have the flexibility just to read anything and then come back and say, I value or devalue this topic. There's certain things you're just not allowed to read. And what's the framework of reference? Anything which would undermine the Yud Gimel Ikarim, the 13 fundamentals of faith, as is dictated by the Rambam. Say davening every day after davening, which is the Ani Ma'amins, the Yigdals, is also just a paraphrasing of those 13 principles. And that's the framework he said, which would mean that if you're going to read a book on biblical criticism, which talks about biblical authors, in plural, you're not allowed to read that book. That's what you'll be saying, because that undermines just the verse of the Ikarim, that they're right, and the number 7 as well, Torah min hashamayim, and so these are basic things you're not supposed to be reading. In the academic world, this doesn't exist at all. In the academic world I put all information on the table, I read it all, I evaluate it, and then I choose what's right. The problem with that, as Rav Dessler points out, and it's a very important thing, is bias. Is through my engagement, I'm no longer the same person to evaluate what's right and what's wrong after I've read it, which means the decision needs to be made before I get there. On the other extreme, you could say, in Israel, sometimes there's cereal boxes with pictures of dinosaurs, and in certain communities they won't allow those because dinosaurs didn't exist, so they will not buy the dinosaurs. So meaning, you understand, so how far does this go? In both directions is a complicated business, right? Well, how to thread this needle. But nonetheless, he says the framework is the Yirgul Moikarim. If something falls outside of the purview of that, then it's considered apikursus, heresy, and may not be read. That's what he observes. In response to this, there was an essay written by Dr. Mark Shapiro, and he later turned this essay into a book. The book we called The Limits of Orthodox Theology. And in responding to Rav Parnas' article, he says the following. This is in his article called Maimonides' 13 Principles, the last word in theology. And he says, having made these preliminary remarks, we may proceed to analyze Rav Parnas' point that heresy is defined by the rejection of any one of the Maimonides' 13 principles. Presumably, Rav Parnas did not mean to say that only the 13 principles and nothing else are the determinants of what constitutes heresy, for it is undeniable that no rabbinic figure has ever believed this, meaning there are many more things than just the 13 principles of faith that could make a problem, right? If you read the Rambam in Hilchos Tshuva, he has a lot of things there, right? I say this for the simple reason that Maimonides' 13 principles are not all-inclusive. Thus, they do not include the idea that the Jews are God's chosen people. In addition, there are a number of dogmas which the Maimonides discusses in other places that excludes from his 13 principles. For example, there is no mention of the principles about the existence of only one God or free will, despite their overriding importance in Maimonides' thought. All this lends credence to Arthur Hyman's point, already anticipated in part by the Barbanel, that the 13 principles were never intended to comprise in their totality the most important aspects of Judaism. Rather, they were merely formulated so to correspond to the structure of the Mishnah in the tractate Sanhedrin, upon which the Maimonides was commenting. Because of this, not all Maimonides' dogmas were included in his 13 principles, but this does not in any way imply that they are less important. We'll now proceed to show one by one how Maimonides' 13 principles met with great opposition. And then he goes through each of them and shows you there's a debate about each of the 13, most of the 13 principles between different. One of the famous ones is the fifth principle is that Hashem does not have any body parts, is not limited by physical structure, right? So on that the Rava disagrees and says, it's not that the Rava believes that God has a body, but the Rava says you would not lose your chelik and olam haba for believing such a thing, which the Rambam would believe. And so he goes on and he brings multiple Rishonim who disagree with the Rambam all the way through. And so, truth be told, what he's saying is that you can't use the 13 principles of faith as the halachic framework for what is in or what is out, or what I'm allowed to read or what I'm not allowed to read, because A, it's not all-inclusive, and number two, is many of them were debated, which means to say perhaps they're not the last word, and you can't use this framework as well. That was his, so he's sort of nitpicking on Rabbi Parnas's framework that he uses. And then he goes on to say, and he says, the goal of this essay is to examine the claim that Maimonides' principles are the last word in the Jewish theology, simply by looking at traditional Jewish sources, and many more could be quoted. It has been shown clearly that both Maimonides' time and both before Maimonides' time and after, many of his views have not been regarded as authoritative. Right? So and therefore, Rabbi Parnas, why are you limiting? Why are you harnessing the Torah matter by this system, which the system itself was under great debate as well. And this article then, of course, triggered a firestorm, and there was much discussion in the Jewish world as to responding to Dr. Shapiro, as to because technically speaking, he is true. So the Forward had a whole discussion about this, and then Rabbi Leff had a response to this. Rabbi Yitzi Blau did a response to this. There's a lot of very interesting discussions that followed this. So one of the quotations in the third line in the Forward article, which quoted Rabbi Bleich, which he wrote a book on this topic, says in the third line is in source 19. He says, once dogmas are presented, there is no room for rejected opinions, even if they are articulated by great rabbis, Bleich told the Forward. The attempt to revive such rejected opinions would now be regarded as heresy by normative Judaism, which means the Rambam says these 13 principles of faith. Yes, there are colleagues earlier and later who disagree with each of those, but they in a certain sense did not make it to mainstream Judaism, right? Meaning, just by normative Judaism accepted the Rambam's 13 principles of faith. So for me to go and find in Ibn Ezra or a Raavad who may technically disagree and sort of revive it as if that he is now on the same standard is not true, because history itself paskins, right? In a certain sense, history itself accepted the 13 principles of faith as normative as well. Similarly, in the Jewish Action, Rabbi Leff wrote an article. He says every serious Yeshiva student knows that there were there were disagreements as to whether the 13 principles of fact were in fact beneficial to posit, and if so, which ones were to be considered principles. Is there any serious Yeshiva student who is ignorant of Yosef Albo Sefer Karim or Ramosha Detrani's Beis Olakim? I hope that stands true. He says, yes, there were disagreements as to what kind of disbelief rendered a heretic. Yet, while there were those disagreements with regard to the various details and the parameters of the principles of the 13 of faith have been the parameters of the principles, the 13 principles have been accepted in their general form as an expression of Torah Judaism. And as stated above, one who denies any of them is outside the pale of faith and community of Torah Judaism. For example, the conviction that God is a corporeal being, like any other corporeal being, is a belief that is outside the realm of Judaism, despite the fact that the sages do not agree whether to deem one a heretic for harboring such a belief. Hence, the principle is true, though its exact parameters are subject to the debate of Torah scholars, which means, in a certain sense, the same thing is there's been a general global acceptance of what it is. Now, why am I quoting all of this now? because I'm going to skip Rabbi Blau, and we're going to skip Dr. Kellner, who wrote a book on this as well. But I'd like to quote Dr. David Berger. Dr. Berger, also a professor at YU, in his Tradition Book Review of Dr. Shapiro, says the following. And I think it's a very profound observation, which relates back to our all or nothing discussion. I'd like to quote source 23 as the closing source today. He says, unlike Kellner, however, I even insist upon the terms like legitimate and authentic. We have an obligation to maintain the boundaries of faith bequeathed to us by our ancestors. And we cannot do this by describing even fundamental deviations as points on a continuum. Right? Meaning if it's all just, postmodernism and everything kind of has a value depending on what value I accrue to it. Let me illustrate this point in a very personal way. In my mid-teens, I experienced periods of perplexity and in a struggle while reading books of biblical criticism. He's a great scholar. He's he's a full mind. While I generally resisted arguments for the documentary hypothesis with a comfortable margin of safety, there were moments of deep turmoil. I have vivid recollection of standing at an outdoor Kabbalah Shabbos at camp, overwhelmed with doubts and hoping that God would give me the strength to remain an Orthodox Jew. What saved me was a combination of two factors: works that provided reasoned arguments in favor of the traditional belief, and the knowledge that to embrace the position that Torah consists of discrete, often contradictory documents was to embrace not merely error, but apikursus. If I had been told by a credible authority that there's nothing a Jew must really believe, and the only danger was that I was to move to a different point on the continuum, I'm afraid to face the question of what might have happened. That's a very profound observation. What he's saying is like this. This is such a profound observation. Is what saved him was the realization that there actually was an objective fence. That there was a point that actually is in or out. There's a boundary to Jewish belief. Because if I'm going to go in that direction, I'm going to be out. And therefore, I will have to climb over that fence to be inside of it for it to matter. If there's no fence, it's just, everything's a debate, right? Everything is a matter of discussion, and there's somebody who said this and somebody who said that, then nothing means anything. And if nothing means anything, once I've lowered the bar to that point in time, there's nothing that would have saved him from realizing that there needs to be an inside and an outside. It's such a profound point in belief. And it comes back to the very same discussion that we have over here. It's sometimes in today's generation, we're so used to lowering the bar in order to accommodate those who are struggling that we forget that sometimes it's also a disservice to those who are struggling that nothing means anything anymore. That everybody's going to be getting a trophy after the sporting event. That everybody's getting an award. That means to say that there's no value in those awards. If Judaism doesn't have an inside or an outside in belief, then itself is meaningless. Itself has no value. And so part of the struggle in this very topic, and it's a struggle we have all the time because we have this in our minds about the goals we set for ourselves, is if the goals are too lofty, we fall flat and we don't get back on the bus, maybe at the end, if there's enough and re-entry for the end of the U-curve. Maybe, right? But if the goals are too low, on the one hand, we make and achieve them, but we've been doing that anyway, so there's lack of value in the achievements. Part of the goal when dealing with ourselves is, and this is halacha, all these aspects of it are Judaism in its various different places dealing with this, is how high is the bar. Part of it dealing with ourselves is trying to find that balance of stretching ourselves beyond our comfort zones, doing more, but also at the time not making unrealistic stretches, because otherwise we know ourselves on day 3, we're already done and there's nothing left and there's no value. This is such a profound topic. I believe that it's couched in many aspects of our Jewish life. And I give the bracha to myself, to everybody here as well, that we find that balance, the balance in ourselves, the balance in our kids and our grandkids, the balance in our community in trying to figure out how to make the guidelines for success of so many people. Thank you everybody for being here. Have a beautiful day and a wonderful week ahead.